So blurt out if you have anything that comes up. She asked me to come and talk about work comp and a little bit of sort of answer other questions that might come up related to running a business and insurance and stuff. So I handed you a notepad, this is yours to have, and a pen, that's yours to have. And then these flyers, and these flyers are really big and have a lot of sort of unrelated information, but kind of the two important parts are like right here, this is the second inside page, and the third inside page. The rest of it is just talking about claims processes and stuff. But so you guys are of the mind that you're at some point probably going to work in a business helping making business decisions, right? That's kind of where this class goes towards. Anyone familiar with workers' compensation insurance? How are you familiar with it? Have you collected on it? Have you had to buy it? How do you know about it?
Well, there was one day at work that the TV fell off the wall, and if I would have been standing at the till, it would have hit me in the head and knocked me out.
Sure. Okay.
But I got like some kind of like, I don't remember what it was called. I don't know, they added something to my paycheck because it was like a liability and I died.
Yeah, they were worried about, okay. Okay, and you had one too, right?
Not me personally,
Okay.
but I worked at Aurora Plains Academy,
Okay.
and we had a gentleman, well, we had a few injuries, we've had people who had a broken collarbone because of a child in a restraint, and I've had a coworker have his leg broken.
Yeah.
I'm very vital.
Job like that, that's very important, very important. Okay, so first of all, to understand workers' compensation insurance, I always say you have to understand what we had before we had workers' compensation insurance. So if you go back to the 1920s or before, if you're working a job, you're working in a factory, and there's an unsafe piece of machinery, and people keep getting their finger cut off over and over, right? It's kind of machine, somebody stamps it down, and over, people keep getting their fingers cut off on the darn thing. At that point in time, if you got hurt while you're at work, you have to prove your employer was negligent, that they failed to do something a reasonable person would do. That's always the key with negligence, is did they fail to do something a reasonable person would do? So did the employer know about it? Did it happen all the time? Was it the standard way that the industry did things? And if you could prove that their employer was negligent, then they owed you for your injury. The problem with that is, of course, in most cases, low-paid employees can't really afford legal representation, especially not the quality of legal representation that their business owner, the factory owner, could afford to get. So if you, as the very low-paid worker back in the 1920s, got your finger cut off and now you couldn't work your job anymore, you went and tried to find an attorney, and if you couldn't afford to pay an attorney, you might not get represented, and sometimes people ended up where they got serious injuries or got hurt and couldn't get compensated anything for it. So throughout the 1940s and 1950s, organized labor, like unions, and large employers, factory employers, kind of got together and came up with a system called workers' compensation insurance. And I wrote the technical title, Workers' Compensation and Employer's Liability. It's usually called work comp, but people tend to forget about that employer's liability portion of it too. So I wrote that down before we started here. So under the new system, they said, all right, we're going to have these things come up, and instead of having everybody go to court and fight about whether or not the employer did something right or wrong, we know these people have to be taken care of. When something happens at work, somebody's got to pay the hospital bills, somebody's got to deal with those lost wages. And rather than putting it all on the employee, we're going to say that up to a certain point, you don't have to prove that your employer was negligent in any way. Just simply that you were at work, that if you got hurt, there was money available. It's that simple. You're at work and you got hurt. Didn't matter if the employer did something right or wrong, didn't matter if the machinery was safe or not, there's going to be a pool of money. Now that can be done a couple different ways. Large employers set aside a pool of money and run their own workers' compensation insurance, but most people go to an insurance company and buy insurance coverage to take care of these things. So if you run an office, you run an accountant's office, it's a fairly common one for us to deal with, come into somebody like me and say, okay, we've got all these employees, and if they're hurt on the job, we want to make sure they're taken care of, you buy workers' compensation insurance. Now you're generally required by law to carry workers' comp if you have any paid employees. As a business owner, you don't have to cover yourself, but you have to cover any employees for injuries. Now that pays for injuries, it can pay for disabilities, so time off of work, medical expenses, it can sometimes pay for counseling, it'll pay some death expenses. So you as the office manager in the accountant's office say, well, a lot of our accountants go out to farms to work with our farmers throughout the year, and if on the way they're killed in a car accident, what happens? Well, if we go back to the old system, back in the 1920s, that killed employee, their family, would then have had to go hire an attorney and sue and prove that in some way the employer was negligent for you getting killed while you're driving a car. Well, now since we've long since scrapped that, all they have to show is were they working? Yes, they were working because they were on their way to an appointment for their job. Were they hurt or were they killed? Yes. Okay, then the employer's on the hook. In South Dakota, the employer's on the hook for the first $100,000. That's not a lot of money, but that's all that the state requires. We got a pool of $100,000, so you as the accountant's office got this insurance policy, it'll pay $100,000, it'll take care of the first $100,000. Now after that, if that policy limit is used up, it goes back to the old-fashioned system. It defaults back to what used to be there. So again, we got, okay, instead of being killed, you're disabled for a long time, never able to work again as that accountant office employee, never can work again because of the severe injuries that you've had from this car accident. Collect the first $100,000 from your insurance company, and then after that, the employee or the employee's family can again take you into court and show, if they can show you were negligent, they're on the hook. Now, like I said, South Dakota requires $100,000. First thing to know is a lot of people do buy higher limits than this because $100,000, when you're talking about lost wages and medical bills, doesn't go very far. And it's well worth it if you're thinking about being the business owner or being the office manager. Not having to defend yourself from a lawsuit is good for lots of reasons. It's very expensive to hire an attorney to defend yourself in lawsuits. And also the PR that comes as a result of this, you know, your employee was hurt, a small town like Mitchell. Employee gets seriously hurt and the employer says, here's $100,000, we're done, take us to court. It doesn't look good and you could lose customers as a result of that. So a lot of our customers buy either a $500,000 or even $1 million limit. And for most work comp policies, from here to here is $100 and from here to here is another $100. You're talking about $200 to go from $100,000 up to $1 million of insurance coverage. If you have insurance, the insurance company's going to take care of the bills. Now they're going to make sure that the treatment that you receive is reasonable, so that it's not being overcharged, it's not beyond what a reasonable person would do, but beyond that they're going to pay the bills until they hit the policy limit. Once the policy limit is used up, whatever that policy limit is, it again goes back to the old-fashioned system, where you go hire your attorney, you go to court, you prove out that your employer was somehow negligent. Now sometimes an employer wasn't negligent. If we go to that car accident case, was the employer negligent? Did they do something wrong? Probably not. You're driving your own car, going to an appointment, anybody could expect you should be able to drive a car safely. So in that case, you're working, if you're the employee working for this accountant's office, you're never able to work again, the accountant's office has $100,000 for you to collect, you collect that. After that, if you can't prove the employer did something wrong, you're on the hook for yourself. You're out. So you have to be able to go to either disability insurance or Social Security or possibly not collect anything. So I always encourage people, first of all, if you're working in a job, make sure they have work comp. It's very important. In South Dakota, your employer gets a packet with a letter that says, I have insurance, basically. It's signed by the insurance company. They can hang up on a wall with all those disclosures about fair pay and whether or not they can use a polygraph on you. It's usually hung up with those, and they'll say, we have workers' compensation insurance. That's very important. If you're in charge, if you're making decisions, if you're advising somebody, the more the better. It's a small cost increase to change that coverage amount to a higher limit. And you'd hate to be the person in a small business who went to the family of the person who just died and said, you know, we could have spent $100 or $200 a year more, but we didn't, so here's your $100,000 and you're done. So that's why we have work comp and how it works. Now, let's see, the jobs we were talking about, where were you working at where the TV fell off the wall?
Spare Change Casino.
Spare Change Casino, okay. So you do sort of waitressing type of work?
Casino attendant.
Attendant, okay. Casinos are slightly more expensive to insure. You're working at Aurora Plains, very expensive to insure. So how does an insurance company decide what is an appropriate premium for you to pay? Just like car insurance, just like house insurance, we look at all kinds of statistics. We look at information about your business, how it's run, what your employees do, what kind of claims you've had in the past, so that we're charging a fair rate to everybody. It's not right that they should have to pay the same rate as your employer has to pay because the people working at your employer are more likely to get hurt. So there's a group called the National Council for Compensation Insurance. It's a